Follow her immediately. I hesitate before going in. I trust Mrs. Claus. I look to see if anyone followed us, then dive in. Yeah. You take a quick look around you. No one's around, so you dive down to the trapdoor. The trapdoor closes behind you, latching itself. A strong wind boils up out of nowhere and blows the smoke away from you. You see Mrs. Claus standing a few feet from you. Her right hand is stretched forward, channeling the wind. The smoke boils and surges as it's pushed back, but it has nowhere to go. "True heart," says Mrs. Claus, "would you mind letting the smoke out?" I turn into a giant badger and burrow through the wall. I use smoke and fog all the time for cover and magic tricks. I know how to get rid of it. I climb back up to the trapdoor and try to pick the lock near. Hoping to impress Mrs. Claus, you strike a dramatic pose and snap your fingers. Small flask appears, the one you used for cleaning up the smoke after last year's talent show. You turn to wink at Mrs. Claus, but you stumble and the flask drops. It pops open when it hits the ground and more smoke spills out. Oh boy. "True heart," cries Mrs. Claus, "what are you doing?" "I forgot to clean it out, I'm sorry," you say. Mrs. Claus frowns and focuses on the flask. It glows bright white and all the smoke in the room pours into it with a mighty brushing sound. When the smoke clears, the bottle is a little more than melted slag on the ground. At least it worked. She drops her hand. Her glove has been shredded away and 2 of her fingernails are bleeding. She removes both of her gloves and folds them carefully before putting them in a pocket. You get a chance to look around. This cavern is older than the other. Real Christmas trees had been stored here, which explains the fire. A disturbingly squishy mound of withered and singed old oranges lies next to you, and the ground is littered with sizzling, sooty copper pennies stamped with Queen Victoria's image. Towing through an unusually large pile of ash, you see a few fragments of what must have been thousands of cornhusk dolls. "I'm sorry so much was lost, Mrs. Claus." "It's alright. I've been meaning to clean out these caverns for years. But look, I think I discovered the cause of it." You bend down with her and look at her discovery. A mostly melted fragment of steel lies on the ground, labeled Crinkle Corp. Other smaller fragments are nearby. Asking Mrs. Claus, you say, "How could Crinkle Corp be here? They're mortal." "But Flickering Flame has been here too," she answers. "A collaboration would explain our intruder's success." You look over the fragments on the ground. It might be possible to get more information from them. I piece together the fragments. It seems impossible, but it would be very useful. I send the fragment up to a discreet friend in forensics. I shift into Bloodhound and sniff it for clues. Kann ich nicht? Hey Mrs. Claus, I know somebody upstairs in forensics. Her name is Dusty Litmus, and she's really good at tracing fired weapons back to their owners. Mrs. Claus says, "I wasn't aware that was something that occurred often enough here to merit a full-time position." You say, "Yeah, no, we brought her in after the last gnome uprising. She spent hours in the outer catacombs retracing battles and researching ballistics." Mrs. Claus nods, impressed. "Very well then," she says, "you can send it to her." With the snap of your fingers, the materials flash away. Mrs. Claus says, "How long can we expect to..." Before she can finish talking, a note has appeared in a flash. You pick it up and read it aloud. "Hey True Heart, I took a look at the shrapnel you sent me. It had trace fragments of dough on it, almost baked off. It looks like it was produced near the pasta factory in Boeotia by Thebes. Let me know anything if you need anything else." Mrs. Claus says, "Well, I'll have to give her a raise." Together you move on down into the next layer, this one a few hundred years old. You're struck by the amount and variety of bones here. Bird bones of every size from quail to what looks suspiciously like dodo. Goat femurs, beef ribs, boar skulls, and strange parts of a deer are all piled up in their respective areas. You take a step forward and sink knee-deep into a collection of rotted fruit. It smells like oranges, lemons, and pastry? You remember this era of Christmas very well. The 1600s were a time of great feasting. Half of Claus' castle was taken up by the kitchens. Mrs. Claus steps gracefully onto a pair of oyster shells and lifts you from the mug. You regain your footing and continue to slog on together, Mrs. Claus leading the way. Mrs. Claus stops and you almost run into her. Peering over her shoulder, you see something that you have never ever encountered before. The passageway leading downwards is twisted, like a bubble or partially melted mirror. You see many reflected images of the passageway down, but it's not a mirror. Mrs. Claus says, "Throughout, do you have any idea what this is?" You shake your head. Some sort of maze? I don't know how they did this. Mrs. Claus stretches her hand towards it. "Feel this," she says. "It's like my bones are stretching." She pulls her hand back, and it doesn't seem to have any lasting effect. She looks at you. "Do you think you can get us through this? This is beyond my expertise." You consider the warped space. How do you analyze the anomaly? I stay out and rely on the years I've spent studying instead of going to feasts. My mind is flexible, I throw myself in and learn as I go. I love to work with elegant glass, diamond and mirror in my decorating. I find the pattern. You take careful and measured steps back and forth, analyzing the shift in the patterned reflections from the crystals in the wall. Oh boy. You step closer and the crystals grow dimmer. Then you step further back and they flash brighter. Then you move from side to side and you realize that you've just been blocking the light from the torches behind you. When you turn to ask Mrs. Claus for advice, you find yourself somehow snagged in the middle of the anomaly. Something is definitely off. You see 3 different reflections of Mrs. Claus. Panicked, you try to run back. Eventually, you find her again, but she looks at you in shock, taking a step or 2 back. It's confusing and you can't figure out what's wrong until you notice that her wedding ring is on the wrong hand. Looking around the cavern, you realize that everything is reversed from the way it was before. You take a step forward, but you run into some sort of film. It tears a little. Mrs. Claus says, "I think you should stop. Something has gone wrong." "Don't push forward. Try to find a way to reverse," she says as she points at you. "This." You run back again and eventually find your way out, this time with left and right the way they should be. With Mrs. Claus leading again, you pick your way through, but you don't tell her about the small rip you made in the membrane. You leave the twisted space above and scramble downwards, passing older and older mementos of Mrs. Claus and her past. The 2 of you emerge in a small Roman village, recreated in a cavern. The cavern is filled with carvings, reliefs on the walls, decorations on columns, inscriptions on buildings. Graceful marble statues, still painted in bright and vivid colors, are arranged in rows down a wide arcade. A bower in the center of the miniature village contains a white dress, a tunica recta, bound with a wool belt and the knot of Hercules. Nearby hangs an ornate jeweled robe. An air of great age lies on the cavern. "I didn't know you kept your wedding dress," you say. She smiles and says, "Yes, with the entire town we were wed in. The merit of Diana and St. Nicholas." You remember the day. She looked stunning in her simple dress, with tiny snowflakes following her as she walked. You were in awe of her at the time, proud to be in the service of such a regal queen, and intrigued by her exuberant groom. Her smile falters a bit. You know she's thinking about her husband's death. I reach out and take her hand for comfort. I remain respectfully silent. "I know how you feel, Mrs. Claus. I'm here for you." Remain silent. You turn slightly to the side and studiously pay no attention to the tears in her eyes. When she's had a chance to compose herself, you turn back. I'd like to look around the town a bit, you say. She gives you a smile. The moment passes. At the end of the arcade is a plain wooden door. A silk string across the door has been neatly severed. The door opens easily when you push it. You don't want to offend Mrs. Claus, but you have to ask. Not much of a protection, is it? You know, I trust you, but I have to ask about the string. The silk is gorgeous, but I'm sure it's more than just decorative. I'm curious. Why didn't the string do anything? It's just more than just decorative. Oh boy, das Ding geht halt echt länger, als ich dachte, dass es gehen würde. Das ist ja ein ganzes Buch. She frowns and says, "You've never cared about this sort of thing before. Let's not assemble." She says, "This was one of my most powerful wards. I imbued the string on the day that we were married and saved it. Once Santa died, I knew I needed to keep his heart safe." She bends down to pick up an obsidian knife. It is positively glowing with hatred. They must have gotten in with this. Who knows what unsavory practices they used to fill this one with power. She crushes the obsidian dagger with her fist, and you move through the doorway and into a tight cave. You climb through a narrow tube and over a dip to get to the next cavern. At first glance, it looks like it's filled with a dense forest of birch trees covered in white ash. But soon you realize that it is a forest of stone with the dust of ages gathered on the branches. Mrs. Claus follows your eyes as they scan the room. She smiles. "I didn't want to leave my grove behind when I was driven from Tegia. This was the only way to preserve them. They would have rotted away thousands of years ago otherwise." There are a few snapped off branches in the trees. When you tell Mrs. Claus, she asks you to investigate. As you wander through the forest looking for clues, you kick a stone chip. It flies through the air and hits a tree with a satisfying clack. You keep walking and kick another chip. Clack, another kick. But this one never lands. You focus and look up quickly. A ragged ball of inky blackness is only a couple of inches from your feet. It looks like a hole that has been ripped in the air, but there's nothing behind it. Unfortunately, your forward momentum is carrying you towards the hole. Shift into something smaller to avoid it. Summon and fire off a giant snowball to counteract my momentum. Deploy the safety harness I've been working on. Safety harness. You yank a ripcord and hooks shoot out from a hidden harness in multiple directions. They scramble onto trees and bushes, but only one of them actually hooks. It swings you in a wide curve, and one of your outstretched fingers grazes the hole. You crash into a bush, pick yourself up and look yourself over. With a shock, you find that your fingertips on that hands have been completely sheared off. They grow back, of course, not like a mortal, but you feel like there's less of you. It's deeply unsettling. Oh Gott. Haben wir jetzt auch noch Horrorelemente hier drin? The whole cavern feels slightly depleted and the hole looks just a bit bigger. This isn't good. You scramble back from the blood, calling out for Mrs. Claus. She runs to you in seconds, pulling you up. Then you point to the hole. It's some sort of, I don't know, a sort of nothing. A big hole in the air, you say. Watch. You push a stick into it, then pull it out again. The end has been cleanly sheared off. She says, "It's not like a black hole in the mortal world. Those distort space around them. This looks different, like a rip or tear." You ask, "Is this something flickering flame could do?" She shakes her head and says, "No, I don't know anyone could do this in either realm. The Emerald Empress might know, but even she couldn't do this herself. There's more going on in these caverns than a simple theft. Should we do something with it? It seems dangerous, you say. She asks, do you have any idea on how to make it safe? No matter what you do, it will be incredibly difficult. I can encase it in pure compressed candy cane. I can shift into a caterpillar and cocoon it, let it heal. I know a golem who's out of work. I'll see if she can guard it. I'm not sure we have time for that, says Claus. There's a rare form of caterpillar in the red swamps that can spin a cocoon in 30 seconds. Mrs. Claus nods and stands back. You concentrate on the creature's shape, smell, sounds. Then you close your eyes and feel yourself shrinking. When you open them, you have become a grey plains webworm. Not exactly what you pictured. Is that what you were trying to shift into? Asks Mrs. Claus. No, you say, but it might work. You squirm around the hole, leaving a trail of grey slimy string. After a minute or two, it's encased. Says Mrs. Claus. It actually seems to be working. You look at the rib, which is now fairly well covered. It's not pretty, but it should work. Looking at your companion, you say, Hey, Mrs. Claus, guess what? I feel better now that the hole is covered. She stops and turns to look at you. She says, You know, Trueheart, you have a good point. I wonder if it's tied to emotions somehow. Yeah, you say. Something in the real world, like a bleeder, maybe. She says that's a good point. We'll need to investigate this further. Thank you for addressing this, Trueheart. Mrs. Claus leads you down a dark staircase that opens up into the largest and oldest chamber yet. A sprawling city of pyramids, stadiums, and statues stretches around you. You have an entire city in here? You ask. The Olmecs were fond of magnificent gestures. They built this for me a few years before they abandoned me for what they got in the swamp. You try to take it all in. When you run a hand over one of the statues, you are surprised to feel a pull from it, a tug of emotion. Mrs. Claus runs her hand over the stone. Some of the carvers were bleeders, imbuing the statues with their thoughts and feelings. They are also magnetic here and in the mortal world. I never understood. A spray of gunfire hits the ground near the two of you. You can feel the icy hate in each bullet. It's your duty to protect Mrs. Claus. Switch our appearances to draw gunfire away from Mrs. Claus. I summon a Christmas snowfall to blind the enemy. I release a dozen mousebots to distract and sniff out the enemy. Christmas snowfall kann uns auch stören. Switch appearances. You call on all of your common memories with Mrs. Claus, laboring over the list together, touring the factory floors, sharing tea. With your will, you wish for your appearances to mix and trade with each other. You kneel down and channel thoughts of hiding and deception, but the gunfire breaks your concentration. Your bodies flicker and waver, but stay the same. Trueheart Changeling, what are you doing? A bullet ricochets off of a flagstone, sending shrapnel into her calf. Blood trickles onto the tops of her boots. Her face twists in anger and she snarls. You haven't seen her like this since Valhalla burned. She summons her will and a pulse of energy knocks you off your feet. Lightning bolts stream from the roof of the cavern down to the city around you, frying everything in sight. She shakes her head and reverts back to her ordinary self. She grabs a small jar from her pocket, opens it, and rubs some ointment on her cuts before putting it all back. She looks at you but turns away, embarrassed by her outbursts. You poke out your head and notice something has fallen to the ground. You take a look at the cause of all the trouble. It's a wind-up tin soldier with no label. As you pick it up to investigate, it dissolves into a pile of iron fillings. When you look at Mrs. Claus, she shrugs. She turns to move on and you follow. You slide down once more into a smaller cavern, one filled with cats. Giant limestone carvings of cats, mural depicting cats, and even a few mummified cats. They are all packed closely together and fit in less space than the reindeer stables above ground. I thought there would be more here, you say. I didn't bring much with me from those days. I had too much pride, and I was furious that they forced me from my position as sun goddess. But I was so proud that I had domesticated cats that I had to bring these here. There's another trapdoor here, but it's made of quartz and under a thin layer of water. You say, should I open it? She says, you can try. It can't hurt you no matter what. After stretching, you bend down and lift. It comes up easily and the water drains down. She nods. That's what I expected. It once connected to a deep lake in Scotland, she says, pointing to a small sluice gate in the wall. Manche Wörter. Anyone pulling up the trapdoor would have to pull up all of that water at once, but now there's a counterspell. A musky burnt odor surrounds the gate. It's the same smell you noticed hundreds of years ago at a party when Flickering Flame was still called Loki. Oh, jetzt macht es Sinn. Plot twist. He had just won an epic eating contest against the fire demon. Everyone has a distinct odor to their magic. You don't know yours, of course, just like you can't taste your own tongue, but some people say the smell of your magic is similar to donuts. Do you want me to scrub it, you ask her? She shrugs. We might as well. There might be more than a counterspell here. Flickering Flame is not someone to be trifled with. He was also stronger than you, but he was too set in his own ways to listen to Mrs. Claus. You crouch by the smell and concentrate. Magic can clear out magic if it's focused and refined as needed. You need to find a focus that suits your natural abilities. It shouldn't be hard. I literally focus it with a series of ground lenses. I wear a circlet of holly from the Scottish Highlands. I use a tooth that a polar bear shaman traded me. Holly. You reach into your mind and summon the circlet of holly. It smells crisp and fresh, and you place it carefully on your head. Is that fresh holly? Asks Mrs. Claus. No, it's very old. It has an enchantment of enduring life. That you put on there? Asks Mrs. Claus. You nod. She looks impressed. Haha, wir sind gut. Your emotions pour through the focus and into Flickering Flame's counterspell. Your strategy is simple. Overload the charm with more magic than it can cancel, and you succeed. Steam rises from the enchanted sluice until the spell is gone. A flood of water pours from the sluice and down the open hole. Is that going to be okay? You ask, concerned. That's a lot of water. It's fine, Trueheart, she answers. I designed it this way. Thanks for asking, and thank you for taking care of this. It's time to go now, we're almost there. She steps into the water with her black suede boots. The water quickly freezes over, forming a staircase to the ground below. She notices your look and says, Frost wolf leather, the best for winter boots. You shrink a little inside, remembering your days in a wolf pack, and she says, Don't be so surprised, I was the goddess of the hunt after all. And those who have crossed me will find that I have not changed underneath. She looks taller now, and shows her teeth as she smiles. She extends her hand, which you take, and together you descend down to the most ancient caverns of all. The air down here smells old as you. It's the smell of the young earth, before Christmas, before gods. You are in an egg-shaped enclosure made of earth and wood. The room is dominated by a thick tree hunk. Roots grow from the top and from the bottom, no branches, a marvel of nature. The roots twist into the dirt walls and almost seem to form patterns. Mrs. Claus leads you to a small stone table near the trunk, with a few scattered items on it. A dry mushroom, a circlet of leaves, frozen moonbeam. You try to remember to search the room, but you're distracted by the rush of memories. There are so many things here from your childhood. but you try to clear your head and focus on the search. Clear my head with a simple mantra. I slap myself so I can get a grip. It's embarrassing, but it works. I concentrate and remind myself of the importance of the mission. I left behind a simple world years ago. My life is more refined now. I can do this. This is too young for you, too rustic, you think. But the room calls to you. You run your hand over the tree trunk, the roots. No, you think to yourself, the past never leaves you. As Mrs. Claus searches the room, you saunter over to the table. You grab a small mushroom from off the table. You say, I remember this. It was the first present I gave you. Mrs. Claus gives you a sly smile. I know. I've always treasured it. You set down the mushroom and pick up the frozen moonbeam, playing with it for a while. It reminds you of the blanket you had from the same material. But then Mrs. Claus calls you over. She says, Look, I had a simple ceiling here, done with power. But now it's been entirely drained, and this is what I think was the cause. She points to a toy which you pick up. Puzzled, you look it over together. It's a small purple plastic eggplant with anthropomorphic features. Its limbs and eyes are grey, and it has a perpetual frown. It's labeled, Mr. Grumpyhead, you ask. She nods and adds, by Crinkle Corp. You realize that your hands have gone numb where they were holding the grumpy head, and you drop it. It seems to absorb magical power, she says. So we have 2 foes to deal with, you say with a sigh. Thinking back to the twisted passage and tear in reality, you say, maybe 3. Mrs. Claus shakes her head. It's too easy to classify others as foes. Flickering Flame is the same now as he was when he worked with us. He is a creature of chaos. As for these others, they don't know us and we don't know them. Let's say that our purposes are currently at odds. She looks at the doll. But we don't need this in Claus Castle. We need to get rid of it. But it's clearly magic resistant. I propose disassembling it. I suggest shipping it to a discreet cat I know in Avalon. It would be safe there. Can't dispel its magic draining enchantment, but I have a few tricks up my sleeve. Suddenly shift the spell's target to something else. A discreet cat. Mrs. Claus says, Are you talking about Sebastian of Lockmore? You nod. Exactly. He and I are on excellent terms ever since I found him a half-faced salmon dealer from Alaska. Ich liebe das. Ich mag das echt. Ich liebe es. His Museum of Cursed Magical Artifacts has rigorous security protocols. It will be perfectly safe, and he may know something about it. She smiles in approval and says, Excellent, raw changeling. That will do nicely. She flicks her wrist, sending the doll away. You both move on. Oh, fuck. Mrs. Claus lays her hand on the tree trunk, and it splits open with a whisper of sound. She runs her fingers over the edges and frowns. You notice that the edges are splintered and rough, as if they were recently forced. Together you descend down a short flight of stone stairs into a small stone room. The room is a mess. The walls are burned and chipped, and fragments of cloth and shrapnel litter the floor. Part of the walls seem twisted and warped, and it hurts your head to look straight at them. But you couldn't anyway. Your eyes are fixed on a small stone chest in the center of the room. It's lid wide open, the final resting place of Santa's heart. It's empty. She slumps to the ground and rests against the wall, exhausted. It's gone. I knew it was gone, but I just had to see it. This means the end, true heart. You don't know what to say to that at all. Instead, you look at the tomb. I didn't know this was down here, you say. Nobody did, says Mrs. Claus. I kept the existence of Santa's heart secret from everyone. Except for one. She looks at you directly, almost apologetically. Flickering Flame. I can't believe she would tell Flickering Flame and not me. I can't believe Santa is buried under Claus Castle. I can't believe how far underground we are suffocating. Can't believe pretty much anything when it comes to Mrs. Claus. Believe Santa is buried under Glass Castle. You can't hide the surprise in your eyes. Mrs. Claus gives a half smile and says, "Yes, I know it's a surprise, especially after the funeral you gave for him, but Christmas depended on this secret." She takes your hand and you walk away from the tomb. So, uff. Ich weiß nicht, oh Gott, ich sitze jetzt länger hier, als ich dachte. Ich glaube nicht, dass ich dieses ganze Ding durchnehmen werde. Das hier werden wahrscheinlich schon mehrere Videos. Aber ja. Es ist sehr viel länger, als ich erwartet hätte. Das hat irgendwie nur 2 Euro oder so gekostet. Das ist ein volles Buch, glaube ich, wenn es fertig ist. Deshalb glaube ich auch nicht, dass ich das hier jetzt auf jeden Fall nicht während des Adventskalenders durchnehmen werde. Außerdem, wenn euch die Geschichte gefällt, wenn ihr eure eigenen Entscheidungen treffen wollt, dann einfach auf Steam herunterladen, wie ich gesagt habe. Es ist wirklich nicht teuer. Ich werde es auf jeden Fall mindestens privat fertig lesen. Ja. Ich hoffe dann, ihr hattet Spaß beim Zusehen, auch wenn es mal ein bisschen was anderes ist. Ich hoffe auch, dass das Englisch nicht so schlimm war, aber ich glaube, die meisten von euch können Englisch. Wenn nicht diejenigen, die zu jung sind, um Englisch zu verstehen. Es tut mir sehr, sehr leid. Aber ich kann das nicht auch noch alles übersetzen. Dafür bin ich nicht gut genug. Ich verstehe alles, aber übersetzen, frag mich nicht, irgendwas zu übersetzen. Auf jeden Fall würde ich sagen, ciao. Und ja, dann sehen wir uns bei einem anderen Video wieder. So, bevor das Video aufhört, mal ganz kurz, ich hab die Aufnahme eigentlich gerade beendet, aber ich bin hier mal zu den Stats gegangen. Das ist voll interessant. Wir sind sehr gluttonous, ja. Shifting, Tinkering, Trickery, Cheer. Unsere Relationships sind hier. Ich finde das voll gut. Warum ist unser Christmas Spirit nur bei 42%? Das finde ich nicht okay. Wir sind ein Happy Helper, Open-Minded. Ja, ich finde das sehr cool. Und hier auch die Achievements. Zeigen mir, dass ich diese ganze Geschichte nie im Leben ganz vorlesen kann. Dark Secrets, Learn the Truth about Santa's Death. Die beiden scheinen noch normal zu sein, aber hier, find a job in the mortal world. Become the head of a cult. Destroy Christmas. Be the last person standing at the end. Friend Cerberus. Wo kommt der denn jetzt her? Win a war decisively. Betray Mrs. Claus and the rest of the elves. Bring someone back from the dead. Ich werde wahrscheinlich noch mehrere Stunden privat hiermit verbringen. Also, ich glaube, das ist halt echt wert, wenn man Geschichten mag, für Leute, die gerne lesen, ist es halt echt wert. So. Ciao. Wollte das nur mal gezeigt haben.